I think the talk I'm about to give is really meaningful for me, both personally and to the history of this place. We're now approaching the 20th anniversary of Dick's death. That will happen in about a week. And the 75th anniversary of his birth occurred about 2 weeks ago. So I think it's a fitting time to kind of revisit his contributions to Gestalt. Because he didn't write, I think they're largely unknown in the greater Gestalt community at this time. And I think it's especially important because I think there's a real danger of those that came here in the 1970s and the 1980s that were exposed to his form of Gestalt practice will kind of have their experience to drop below the horizon of what's being accounted for historically here. So my intent is to kind of step into the fro and correct that. Because I think Gestalt practice was an influence on everything that happened here during that period. And I think it contextualized much that went on here, and it's really impossible to understand the zeitgeist of Esalen during that period without an understanding of him and his work. And I think that any consideration of Gestalt that you would kind of formulate at Esalen, it goes really in two phases. And the first phase was Fritz. He came here first in Christmas of 1963, and he really began teaching here in 64 and left in 69. And Dick's time period goes from 69 really to today, because he died in 1985, but his wife Chris has really continued a real strong representation of his work, and I know many of you probably have met her here at the conference. Do you want to acknowledge yourself, Chris? So I'll organize the talk in four phases. In the first, I'm going to just give a very brief version of his life story, just enough to place his work in the context of his life and times. And in the second, I'm really going to focus on his work, Gestalt practice. What he inherited from Fritz and how he changed it to fit both who he was and his ideas. And that'll be by far the largest portion. And third, I'll do a very dangerous speculation on where he might be today if he had lived. As he died in an accident in 1985, he was hiking in the canyon there. A boulder about the size of the Volkswagen got cut loose up on top and bounded down to the creek and exploded in the creek bottom, and one of the pieces hit him in the head and killed him instantly. So his loss was very sudden here, and his work was stopped very abruptly. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about where I've gone with Gestalt and what my journey has been as a student of his and now as a student of intersubjective systems theory. And I've got to say I have a little trepidation about talking about this life, because he postulated three essentials for Gestalt: no judgment, no coercion, and no analysis. But the quote actually continued later in his life, but I break my own rule when I lay out my paradigm, message, program, filter. So that lets me some leeway. And message, program, filter is something we'll learn about today. It was his way of articulating how experience is organized across the lifespan, what we might now call today the organization of experience, or what Wheeler might call ongoing structures of ground. And I really want to make a disclaimer here as an intersubjectivist. This is my take on who Dick was. It's a partial perspective contextualized by my particular point of view and my particular relationship with him. And like any intersubjective endeavor, it has to be stated that that's just what it is. And anyone else's view of him could be equally valid. It would obviously be different, because my view of him intersects at where our intersubjectivities meet and overlap. So this is my take on Dick. It is not the quote-unquote truth. It's just my particular perspective, based on knowing him and talking to quite a few people who also knew him. My doctoral dissertation was a psychobiography of Dick on the model of Edwin Stoll's Faces in the Cloud. So I know far more about him than I can talk about today, but I just want to give you a little flavor of what his life was like. We were going to have a slideshow, but we had some problems, so we won't get to kind of go there. Dick was born in Chicago, Illinois, in 1930, and his immediate family at the time consisted of his mother Audrey, his father Herman, a twin brother. Dick was the second birth of twins, and a sister a couple of years older by the name of Joan. His father had been born in Lithuania in what was then Tsarist Russia, and came to the United States when he was 15. And by the time he was about 60, he was the executive vice president of Sears. So he had a pretty meteoric rise. He went from a non-English speaking immigrant to the top echelons of American industry. His mother, that is Herman Price's mother, brought the whole family here in 1895 on her own. Her husband had died. They were an Orthodox Jewish family, and it was not a good time to be in Russia. So the whole family came over here when he was 15. Probably the first real major event in Dick's childhood was the death of his twin Bobby. He had an appendicitis that was misdiagnosed because the family pediatrician was out of town at the time. So one week he was completely okay, and the next week he was gone. And it probably polarized the Price family like it would anyone who lose a son at the age of 30. And one, I think, of the outcomings of that was that Joan, Dick's sister, really came under kind of her father's influence much more, and Dick much solely under the influence of his mother. And Dick's mother was the dominant force in the family. She was kind of disliked in the Greater Price family, while her husband Herman was almost idealized in the Greater Price family. And I don't want to go into too much analysis, but I just want to say that being a dominant and controlling woman, I think the legacy of Dick's childhood, in terms of psychological terms, was a legacy of intersubjective context, of accommodation and usurpation. Do those terms need explaining? What I mean by accommodation is just what a child needs to do to maintain needed ties with their caretaker. And if you have a mother who's dominant and controlling and is described by words of her relatives as kind of harsh and cold and frigid and controlling, then the child has to sort of accommodate to the wishes of the mother to preserve needed ties, because that's all important. And I think we need to remember here that the mother was a dominant force in the family and was really in control of Dick. In common parlance, what I think I could say is, to quote Dick's sister, my mother tried to turn Dick into a mirror image of her views. And that's kind of the flavor of it. And by usurpation, what I mean, it's a term Stoller used to describe having to substitute someone else's personal reality, here that of Dick's mother, for one's own. Dick felt that his father was a largely absent figure in his life, and he would later sort of establish a really independent life agenda that really separated himself from his family. That didn't occur until he graduated from high school. He was a champion high school wrestler, graduated from one of the best high schools in the United States, New Trier High School in Chicago. A lot of pressure to go to Harvard. He chose Stanford, according to him, to get as far away from my parents as I possibly could. And that kind of delineation of a life plan out of the confines of that of his parents really began at Stanford. He started as a business major. I think he told Walter Anderson, the chronicler of Esalen, that he felt to be a success, he'd have to be something like vice president or the president of U.S. Steel or the president of American Airlines. And indeed, growing up in a high school, he had friends whose fathers were things like the president of American Airlines. But he discovered psychology, and it started to become a different path for him. He changed his major to psychology. In his plans, I think he studied with Gregory Bates and some, who was a figure here later. His plan, he said if he could have described anything he might have wanted to be upon his graduation from college, it would be something like an anthropologist of mental illness and the mental health system. Graduates from Stanford, goes to Harvard, turned out to be a big disappointment for him. He wrote an exam that he thought was the best one he'd ever written. And he went to Harvard to be in the Department of Human Relations, which he assumed might be a little more friendly to his sort of more humanistic view than Stanford was at the time, with its, quote, rats and questionnaires. And he discovered something that he didn't like. The department there was filled with academic kind of backbiting and bickering, as a lot of psychology departments are. And he got a C on the exam. He knew it was the best one he'd ever written, but he used the exam to criticize what they were doing in the department. So he left Harvard. And kind of, wandering around, wondering what to do next, kind of a life path he'd always considered was to be in the Air Force. So he joined the Air Force. This was about the end of the Korean War. And there were opportunities for people who were psychology majors. And so he hoped to take advantage of that. And he eventually became a trainer of recruits and was stationed at Parks Air Force Base in Pleasanton, California. It's no longer there. And it put him right back where Stanford was, and it enabled him to go back to graduate school while he was in the Air Force. And at that time, that's right in the middle of the beat scene. We're now in the mid-50s, or very early 50s. And he started hanging around up at North Beach. The beat scene was burgeoning. That was happening for him. He had passing acquaintances with both Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg at the time. And he started going back to Stanford by studying with a man named Spielberg, and started a big foray into Eastern philosophy. While he was in the Air Force, was going to school at Stanford. He took a room at the Asian Academy and started studying with Alan Watts. And meditation and Buddhism started becoming very important for him. And he started having experiences that he would go to the professors to get help with, and they couldn't help him. He thought the only people that could really help him with the experiences he was having were the deep people like Gary Snyder. And to further kind of delineate his independence from his family, he got married. And this would have been in February of 1956. Dick's now 26 years old. And his experience at the time started being more and more of what he called immense expansion and excitement. And you can see somebody delineating a life plan completely out of the bounds of their parents. He got married to Bonnie at the Soto Zen Temple in San Francisco. His parents were invited to the wedding, and they weren't particularly impressed, and so we're getting a little bit worried about Dick, I think. The marriage ceremony was in Japanese, the bridesmaid was black, and there were a lot of different ethnic groups represented. And they started to wonder what was going on with their young son. Now keep in mind, this is 1956. As time went on, the Dick's energy got harder and harder to contain. And he ended up with what I'm sure now would be called a manic episode. And was hospitalized for about 3 months at Parks Air Force Base. And I think it was a very important time for him because he'd had a lot of experiences that were spiritual, that was ongoing. He had a lot of psychological stuff, that was ongoing. He managed to get some help. And ended up in an experience where he felt sort of washed clean. He found a young psychiatrist there that started helping him work on his family issues and the things in his past. And he was really ready to get out of the Air Force and come back to his life and his marriage. But through a high level contact in Washington, his father exerted family control, probably at his mother's bidding, and he was transferred to a hospital right near the family home in Kenilworth, which is a suburb of Chicago. And through a long story they really don't need the details of, the reassertion of family control ended up having him committed to, for a period of about a year, almost a year, at a place called the Institute for Living in Hartford, Connecticut. It wasn't too unusual, I don't think, at that time for young men or women, especially from very successful families who were kind of thought to be living outside of the bounds of their parents' control, to be hospitalized. Dick was 26, he was married, his father signed commitment papers. There was some duplicity involved, which we don't need to know too much about, I don't think. But his marriage was annulled after he was committed. And he spent a year in the hospital. Got about 10 ECT treatments, 59 insulin shock treatments, and a lot of Thorazine. He was released from the hospital on Thanksgiving Day in 1957. And he spent the next 3 years living at home in Chicago, working for his uncle. And about 3 years after that, he decided it was time to go back to San Francisco and back to California and try to create a life for himself. And his parents didn't try to stop him. Actually, a friend of his was starting a cooperative called the East West House, and that's where he moved. And you know, I don't think it's possible to really understand Dick and his work without an understanding of the experiences that he went through. And so I'm telling you this just so that you know that this was his life experience up to that point. And he was really desperate, looking for something that could help him. And he went back to California, again active in Buddhist studies. In fact, he went to a lecture by Haridas Chaudhry right after he got back and met Michael Murphy for the first time, who was the other co-founder of Esalen. And in 1961, moved down here with Mike because this was Mike's family property at the time. And I just want to briefly touch on the fact that, which seems, should seem obvious to some people, that how, to look at this hospitalization that he had as kind of a concretization of a whole backlog of experience of parental control. Does that make sense to you? And I think his lifelong personal struggle to deal with the residue of accommodation, usurpation, institutionalization, both shaped his interest and vision for Esalen as a place, and how he would go on to develop his unique form of Gestalt work, Gestalt practice. And Dick's hope, and he said this to many people, is that Esalen could become a place to help people who had gone through experiences like the ones that he had. And over the years, I think Dick helped a lot of people who, to his own admission, quote unquote, otherwise would have been locked up. It's almost as though he took a vow to help people who were in the position he was in, and to prevent them from having to go through what he went through. And it was a big motivation for Dick. So Mike and Dick were equal partners. They founded Esalen in '62, a year after they had moved down here in '61. Mike's family had the property, and Dick, through a trust in his family, had the financial means to get the loan to get this place going. And they took very different roles from the beginning of the place. Mike was the more entrepreneurial person, and Dick was more reserved and took over the actual running of the place itself. In fact, he didn't take a day off for the first 8 or 10 years he was here. It was quite a venture in its early days, and no one was really sure off whether the place would succeed or fail. Dick would kind of be in recovery mode at the time, still kind of lingering pain from the hospitalizations, a lot of which he attributed to the insulin coma treatments, insulin shock treatments. And he'd go in and out of the workshops looking for things that he could really use to help himself. And then Fritz came in 63, 64, and I'll just read you a quote from Dick. Mike and Dick weren't very initially impressed with Fritz. To quote Dick, "At first I didn't trust him. I saw him putting people down and having very little patience. If someone was obviously disturbed and came to see him and Fritz wasn't interested, I'd seen him just turn away. It was almost brutal." And he wasn't an easy man to deal with business-wise, which was Dick's job at the time. But a big turning point came for Dick in his life in January of 1966, when Jeannie McGowan, a nurse he had met here, and who was living with him, they split up, and Dick dropped into one of Fritz's workshops in pain. And he did some very important work with Fritz. And he discovered a very different Fritz Perls than the person he had come to know in his capacity as the big cigarette. A quote that will show that change from Dick: "In the context of the group, I saw him as loving and patient and sensitive. It was just like a coin turned around. All the things I thought that he was utterly without in the course of the group, he had with a richer degree than anyone I had ever witnessed." So when Dick really kind of figured that Fritz's style of therapy really had something to offer, he immediately became one of Fritz's primary students. And he was asked, what was the deal? Did you have a big aha experience when you worked with Fritz the first time? What was the catch for you? And I think Dick's answer is very telling. He said, "I think it was a product of the whole week. From the beginning exercises, Fritz simple, what is your experience like? Okay, is this all? Not, is this all, in the sense that this is it. This is an approach. I don't think anyone had ever asked me, hey Dick, what is your experience? It seems so simple and so right." And as Fritz's apprentice and eventual successor in terms of leading Gestalt groups and trainings here, I think Dick played a very prominent role in making Esalen a major Gestalt center and in promulgating Gestalt in the United States. So, this is a convenient place to stop for me, and I would like to take questions now, because the next part of my talk will be by far the longest, and it will be concerning the evolution of Dick's work here. Sure, go ahead.
You had referred to his major crisis in regards to the hearings. I was just wondering, because it sounds like he labeled them as spiritual experiences, did he ever label that as like a spiritual emergence?
He did later. Those words weren't current at the time. I think by the time Dick got to be older, he did label what was happening for him as spiritual emergence. Earlier, he did use terms like psychotic break. He did use terms like psychosis. But, and I've heard him on tape saying both sides of the coin. I think he thought that he was having experiences that were very important to him. And some of them were definitely spiritual in nature. And Dick was a very spiritual man. I mean, more so than almost anyone I've met. He had a presence about him and a natural acceptance of other people that I think came from that foundation. And I think some of what was happening for him was a spiritual emergence. There's another way to look at it. They diagnosed him as being paranoid schizophrenic, but I've worked in mental hospitals, and if he came in to the hospital today, it just seems having a manic episode. And I think the way I've chosen to look at it, through the lens of intersubjectivity theory, is, Brandschaft is really somebody who, Bernard Brandschaft, this is in Los Angeles, has really seminal sort of insights into mania. And one of the pervasive meanings of mania is that mania is a manic protest against life agendas that are laid out for you that are not felt to be authentically run. And there's kind of a liberating exuberance that Brandschaft talks about when he talks about manic experience that fits precisely with what Dick's experience actually was at the time. That there was he was feeling kind of an immense expansion and an expansion into new possibilities. And the other side of the coin is unfortunately, is that manic episodes are usually never successful because it's an experience of freedom, but there's no undergirding psychological sort of organization that can support it. And so then when that kind of collapses, it goes the other way into depression. And that is what happened to Dick. And I think another way to look at it is that, Dick felt that there was something really false going on in the hospitalization, and that is that this was an attempt to blot out personal experience rather than to try to understand it. And I think it really propelled him into having really a lifelong care for people and to try to understand their experience. And often, I think one of the things it did is it made the horizons of his experience so wide that he was really able to help people who were going through experiences like he had in a way that I almost saw no one else be able to do it. Does this make sense? Yeah. So, is that good? That's a good enough answer? Go ahead.
A simple question. What year was he at Harvard?
He graduated from New Trier High School in '48, graduated in 4 years, straight A student at Stanford in psychology, went to Harvard in 1952 or 3, was there for 1 year, completed the year. He kind of thought that he'd really created some enemies out of Jerome Bruner and a couple other people in the department, although Henry Murray, who ran the Department of Social Relations there, would have been an ally. He wasn't kicked out or anything. But he decided that he couldn't really live on a diet of academia alone. One of the things that happened for him at Harvard is he, given up his wrestling career. He was a star wrestler in both high school and in college at Stanford. And he was not in too good a shape himself when he left Harvard. And he realized that.
Philip, what years were you there?
I was there in 51 to 52. I just missed it. But I could confirm that the Department of Social Relations was quite conflicted at that time. Among other things.
Yeah, he couldn't believe it. He got there and they made him start studying experimental psychology, which is the last thing he was interested in.
Was that the time of Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzger?
I think that would have been later.
A little later.
Was Julian Silberman, did he have an influence on Dick?
Oh, yeah, Dick. It's later in the story. They don't know each other yet.
Okay, so that's
Leary
when Dick
left in
goes to
63.
Agnes and when Julian's here and...
Yeah. In fact, Dick brought Julian here in hopes that he would do the Agnes project, which I'll talk a little bit about later.
Didn't Dick end up having another break and going into Agnes?
Yeah, I wasn't going to talk about that, but Dick did have a second, I hate the word psychotic break.
Yeah, I don't like it either.
Dick had another kind of episode that landed him in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. And this would have been in 1969.
No, 'cause I think I was
And he was hospitalized for about a week at Agnews, and it was ironic because Agnews was actually setting up the very program. So Julian talks about going to pick Dick up at Agnews, and Dick looking like in front, looking at what was going to be his new project. But the second psychotic episode that Dick had is a lot more difficult to understand, and I think it has less to do with mania than it does to do with self-fragmentation and states of psychic dissolution, probably. There are some wild stories that happened about it, and he tried to take care, because he knew the second one was coming on, so he tried to take care and keep his parents out of the picture, because he'd already been through that once. And he was taken to a few places around here, and there was a real attempt to let him be able to work through his experiences on his own, to quote him, without psychiatric interference. But it went on long enough that they decided, it's one of his best friends, a psychiatrist, actually had him took him to Agnes. Yeah, so there, in Dick's career, he landed in the hospital twice. Once for almost a year, the second time for a week.
Where's Agnes?
Agnes is by San Jose. I don't think it's still there, but it was a state hospital. As long as we're talking about it, might as well get it. Dick was a tremendous supporter of alternative views for mental health due to his experiences. And there were, I think, he was really instrumental in the United States in considering those things. He brought Ronnie Lang to the United States, and the whole idea of Agnes, what it was that it was to be set up like Kingsley Hall, Lang's place in England, and let people work through psychiatric, episodes without interference. And it's actually quite an amazing project. With Silverman, who ran it, he called the project Ding Dong City. Because a lot of people went up here and worked with everybody up there, but they did a double-blind study. And the double-blind study proved with 3-year follow-up studies that people that were going through quote-unquote psychotic episodes had better results not being given Thorazine, which was the drug of choice at the time. And it was one of the only studies that's ever been done like that. Dick's hope in the whole thing was that he would use Julian Silverman, and you could begin to set up a protocol for people that would determine which people needed psychotropic medications and which people didn't, which people would really profit from being able to kind of go through the experience with help, and which people really needed drugs. That was the hope of the study, but that never got fully realized.
Did he use psychedelic drugs?
Yes. Yes, he did. Dick was always interested in psychotic experience, what we might call that, what I would call alternate states. If you say altered states, that's problematic because that assumes a common sense reality that you're altering yourself from. But alternate states is something he was fascinated with from the time he was preceding any of his hospitalizations. But Dick described to Walter Anderson and many people the first time he took LSD was in 1961. It was still a legal drug. He took it in John Perry's office in San Francisco with a man named Stephen Schoen. And it was a legal drug at the time. And he had been under what he described as a pall of depression after his release from the Institute of Living, or Institute for Living, it's called. And he said it was the best day he'd had since he got out of the hospital. That kind of pall of depression began to lift. And he said he had a very good experience on it. And he regretted that he didn't follow up that experience because he was advised to be very careful in his use of it at the time. So I think, his interest in all alternate states is fundamental in the development of his work called Gestalt practice. So, is it time to go on here? Okay. Dick was, Fritz's chosen successor at Esalen for Gestalt work. In fact, Dick went to Lake Cowichan after his release from Agnes Hospital, did some work with Fritz, and Fritz pronounced him cured and ready to come back and lead groups. In the first group they were to do together, Fritz and Dick would have co-led the group here, but Fritz died. Dick led the group and continued leading groups and trainings. He didn't like the word training, he thought that's what you did with dogs. So he called he had Gestalt practicums, and continuously until he died. And he started leading the groups here with what really he thought was Fritz's full permission. And as Dick said, what I got from Fritz, I put in my own wine bottle. I'm Dick, and I'm not Fritz. I have a lot of appreciation for Fritz's actual allowance to take what I have and do your own thing with it. I think the way to get into talking about Dick's unique form of Gestalt is something he used to say. He said Gestalt practitioners tended to model Fritz's personality rather than his theory. And I think that's a really important place to start. Because whereas Fritz loved to be on stage, he liked dramatic interactions with his groups and with his clients, Dick was reserved and he was very quiet and he disliked the limelight. So it was really imperative for him to develop a very different style of working, and one that kind of implied a very different understanding of the essential features of Gestalt. And the fruition of that development is really captured in the phrase that he called his work, Gestalt practice. Not Gestalt therapy, Gestalt practice. And I think, at least in my mind, there are four principal sort of influences on Dick. And I'll just mention them and then go into them in a little more detail. The first was Dick's interest in Buddhist studies and meditation practice. That's where the term practice really comes from. And second was his interest and exposure to working directly with the body. He was a former champion athlete, and he was a very body-oriented person. And he continued to seek out body-oriented work his entire life. The third was his interest in psychotic states or alternate states, as I've mentioned. And it was a long-standing interest, predating his own experience with disruptive states, which is what I think I prefer to call psychotic experience. And the fourth is the legacy of his familiar past, the legacy of what I have termed to call accommodation usurpation.
Accommodation what?
Usurpation. So the term practice comes out of his Buddhist studies. Dick had a long-standing interest in meditative approaches to living, dating from the mid-50s when he started studying with Alan Watts. If Fritz was the showman on stage, Dick was the monk in the shadows. And as he grew older and more settled in his approach, it really did feel like a meditation space when he was working with people. It's remarkable here, if you watch tapes of Dick working, what the tapes can never show you is the emotional tone in the room. And I know the first time I ever saw Dick work, my background was in religious studies. I was a religious studies major at UCSB in Santa Barbara, and so I'd been meditating for a while. And the first time I ever saw him work, I realized this guy's doing a spiritual practice. This is something to pay attention to. And that was very much part of who he was. He was doing an awareness practice for himself that was palpable in the room. He used to say things, his little admonitions are kind of interesting. He said, your job as the facilitator is to create space so they can fill it. And he was just an amazing creator of space in that way. And more about practice, Dick was somebody who was always synthesizing practices. I think that a lot of Dick's contemporaries here at Esalen didn't really appreciate how hard Dick had to work on himself to maintain his own psychological equilibrium. He'd been through a lot, and the practices that I think were the most essential and most important for him were Buddhist meditation, strenuous physical activity, and the use of nature. He really knew how to use nature. Running, hiking, he built rock walls around here, and body work and Rolfing especially. He was famous for being able to take the deepest work anybody could dish out in Rolfing. And there were some characters here who worked on like Double E who yeah. And psychedelics, Boji, that's something he did. Psychedelics took on a very prominent role here. They used to call, the first programs here, that there were residential programs, they called themselves psychonauts. And that was right during the, space, and the job was to explore inner space. And so psychedelic drugs had a very positive kind of regard here. And I think it follows some from the work of Lang, that, in Lang's view, psychotic experience didn't have to be all breakdown, it could be breakthrough. And I think as John Heider talks about Dick's use of psychedelics, I think a lot of it was about training yourself to be in states so that they would come unbidden, they wouldn't be so scary. And a lot of, I think, Dick's taking of psychedelics, it gave him a source of expansive experience. And one of the big kind of metaphors in Buddhism is this idea of open space. And I think Dick's constant exploration, he's somebody who just worked on himself constantly once he got out of the hospital. It was a kind of an endless search. But he was always trying to synthesize a set of practices that would be more effective for him. He took a couple of sojourns out of here, first to Erickson and later to Rajneesh in India, that were designed, as he said, to find the glue that would hold his set of practices together. And so this is another thing that's behind Gestalt practice. Essential practice and tools for working on oneself. And what he used, he recommended to people that were going through experiences similar to the ones he had, and they often work. The second big influence is approaches to working with the body. And I think here we need to look at what the body meant to Dick and Fritz, because I think they were quite different. Dick was influenced by psychotherapeutic approaches to the body, such as Reichian work. He was a big supporter of bioenergetics and radics work later. He was a big supporter of working with body structure, rolfing, massage, with the nervous system through Feldenkrais work, and again his own kind of athletic. Dick was in amazing physical shape as just an individual. He was about 5'10", I think, and weighed about 165. He was very wiry, very muscular, no fat on his body. And it's something he did to manage his own kind of internal restlessness, I think. So practices were very important to him. And so what is this practice, this idea of meditation? What does it mean in his approach to Gestalt? One of the things that it meant is he developed a profound appreciation and understanding for the use of breath as part of embodied living. If you hiked with Dick, he would constantly have his attention on his breath. And it was something that was quite palpable. And he put direct focus on the body core by something he called basic practice, which is becoming established in body and breath. As he put it, basic practice is attention to breath, to movement, to kinesthetic sensations, to sensations in the body, to feeling state, emotion, thought, and image. And what's important, again, is a mode of present-centered contact which doesn't judge what is brought to it. And I think the body meant different things to Fritz and Dick. To Fritz, the body was often used as ground for testing the current figure of interest. And if you watch the films of him, it's almost using the body as a lie detector. Because if you pay attention to what somebody's doing, you can use it as an expression of their unconscious mind. And Dick used to kind of congratulate Fritz for that and say that Fritz was really good at working with extremities and gesture, hands, eyes. He'd often use it to kind of determine what was going on, but it puts you in an adversarial relationship with the person you're working with if you're using the body that way. And Dick said his own work was always more towards core. Dick and Fritz had 3 heart attacks, and he wasn't somebody who was very energetic, so that's one way that they were quite different. But to Dick, I think the body was a place for personal discovery, and there was no adversarial role involved. The body was a place to discover that you're your own authority. Does this make sense? Yeah. The body is grounding. You do breath work at the beginning of a session, maybe do the continuum of awareness, work with whatever comes, and then if experience got too intense, the body was a place to return to as refuge. I think given Fritz's poor health, his body was probably not a refuge for him in the way it was for Dick. And the third thing was his continuing interest in psychotic and other alternate states. We've already told the story of Dick's taking LSD for the first time, and LSD was something he took consistently throughout his life and later in DMA. I think that those experiences had a profound personal importance for him, but in terms of the development of Gestalt practice, it created a comfort in being in states of experience that many people found too disturbing to be in. And Dick's comfort with that was really apparent to the people that he worked with. And I think I want to quote Bob Stolorow here. because I think this is a really important, it's an interpretation, so you'll have to live with it. But Stolero has pointed out just very recently in a paper that people who've been highly traumatized need to connect with someone who they believe is capable of understanding their experience in order to overcome the inherent experiential sense of estrangement that's always associated with trauma. And Dick's experiential horizons in this regard were so wide that it really formed an important part of his work. You know, and then you also have to consider his own experiences of very disruptive states in the involuntary hospitalizations and some subsequent so-called treatment. And I think it's really important to realize that Dick really viewed those treatments as attempts to blot out important personal experience and not to understand it. Even worse, they were used as a means to return him to the consensual reality of his family, which in his view had been the major source of his psychological difficulties in the first place. So that the end result being, again, how wide his experiential horizons were. And finally, I think there's an influence of his familial past, the experiences he had in his childhood, that's also very important. A really clear distinction between Dick and Fritz was that Fritz was really quick to intervene with his judgments and conclusions about the experiences of the people he worked with, and Dick was loath to do that. As Gordon Wheeler has pointed out in his writing, there is an inherent contradiction between Goodman's desire to reduce the authoritarian and judgmental functions of the therapist and the way that Goodman himself had unwittingly created a process in which those very traits could again emerge by focusing on resistance, because it places the therapist in the role of being the expert. And much, I think, of Fritz's personal abrasiveness went unchallenged because of his kind of authoritarian mantle that he took on. But Dick loathed authority and experience with coercion, both familial and institutional, and engendered a profound dislike of judgment, control, and authority. Dick's maxim for Esalen was maximum availability, minimum coercion. And that is a really important part of his view. You know, you could look at it as a reified concept that really serves self-restitutive and self-reparative functions for him. Maximum availability, minimum coercion. And then the three rules that stem from that: no judgment, no coercion, no interpretation, or no analysis, depending on what day he was doing the quote. And I think the problem that Wheeler was trying to talk about, this subtle reintroduction of authoritarian tendencies, was resolved by Dick through an introduction of meditation, largely Buddhist, and a non-judgmental acceptance of a person's experience, no matter what that could consist of. And I think that's the thing that's really important about this, is that this is an element of Dick's contribution to Gestalt practice that had to do with an attitude shaped by his experiences of profound personal trauma and prolonged personal exploration. Does that make sense? One element of Dick's contribution to Gestalt practice had to do with the attitude shaped by his experiences of profound personal trauma and prolonged personal exploration. Wide horizons. Questions to this point?
What do you make of Erickson and Rushdie?
Let's see if I can quote him fairly accurately. With both, he found that, he said something like this: anything you do that goes against the company line is an ego. So they've got you trapped. There's nothing you can do. The only thing you can do is quit, which I did in both cases. His experience with Erickson, you know, Dick was half Jewish, and had a particular poignant part of Erickson for him was A, they accepted him back for the second level of training when he hadn't requested it. B, they were trying to use him to proselytize. And C, he went into an exercise, the conclusion of which everyone was doing a salute to the founder of Erickson like that. And he realized half the people were Jewish, and he had the audacity to challenge that. And they told him it was just his ego and not to worry about it. So he left Erickson. I think what's important, though, is to realize he went to Erickson looking again for a glue to formulate a set of practices that would really work for him. And I think it was subjectively appealing, too, because, Oscar was promising enlightenment. And I mean, I think it's something that had real appeal for Dick. And a lot of people here had been to see Oscar and had told Dick this was great stuff, John Lilly among many others. In fact, Dick once said that the problem with Erickson at Esalen was Erickson cleared our bench, because there were so many people here that went. But again, when he went, he found, kind of he did a kind of a thing. Both Rajneesh and Oscar were denying the authoritarian parts of what he was experiencing. And when he challenged him on it, it's just your ego. So it wasn't a good experience, either one. Rajneesh, Dick even said after he really renounced his affiliation with him, said, his writings are great, but when he went into the groups, he just thought it was an abomination. He went into a group where there was a kind of a psychodramatic, is that right? Did I say that right? Yeah, psychodramatic re-experiencing of a rape that turned into one. He went in, a group of people who were breaking bones, and it was too much for him. But the important thing about it, I think, is that he went really looking. He was always looking for something he could use, using his Gestalt work and using himself personally. And both these groups, both Rajneesh and Oscar, were doing kind of psychological and physical together. And that had a huge appeal for Dick. And he went to them looking for them as systems and for things he could use. Anyone else? Go ahead.
You mentioned different influences. What were his psychological influences, or theories that may have come before?
Dick was really smart and really well read. I think even, I'm trying to think of when this was. This would have been probably 1952 or so. He took a class with Rogers when Rogers came out to the West Coast and taught briefly at Berkeley. And he wasn't really, he had read Rogers and was really hoping to see something more than Rogers was doing. He thought Rogers' work was a little busier than his theory would probably account for. So he was very well read. He read psychoanalytic stuff. He was really familiar with Karen Horney and lots of people. Reichian work he knew very well. Dick, it's tough because I only saw this one time and it left such a lasting impression on me. Dick taught Gestalt within a very simple rule system. And one of the things that was great to learn from him is that he never stepped out of that system when he worked with people. So you were never wondering, Jesus, where did he get that from? But one time, a student over in the big house was particularly, I don't know what the right word is, but it was a particularly convoluted session. Somebody asked him if he would report what he was thinking through that whole session. I was just floored, because not only did he remember everything that happened in the session, he remembered everything he was thinking, and it revealed a depth of psychological knowledge that I was really astounded by. So he was very widely read and knew a lot. You wouldn't necessarily get that from him. He was somebody who was very non-pretentious, very humble. Al Drucker said that, of all the leaders he ever saw here, Dick was the most non-pretentious about his knowledge. And I really would support that. I think that's really true. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was like psychodrama or something. I was wondering.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was just wondering, along those lines, was he influenced by transpersonal psychology, as you mentioned, with psychedelics, with Stanislav Grof?
Yeah, he and Stan were friends. He brought Stan here, actually, I think. I think maybe it was Mike. Could have it was either Mike or him, but they knew each other, and I think Dick was a tremendous supporter of Stan's work, especially his early breath work. And Stan, I think, was a really important person at Esalen. But, transpersonal wasn't a term that is as popular, I think, back then than now. I mean, did he know about that stuff? Sure. If you look at an old brochure for Esalen from 1964 or 5 or 6, you're going to see who the who's who in American psychology that were coming here. And so Dick had an opportunity to see all those people work. And go ahead, Gordon.
Could you comment about Jungian psychology? What was Dick's relationship, perspective to those?
I don't know. I never personally heard Dick talk about Jungian psychology. I don't know if he... Chris, could you speak to that? Do you know?
Certainly didn't reference it often, but it's almost as if he was living so often in the archetypal state by choice that I would say it wasn't so much an intellectual idea, but like, let's go there and play, was his intent. I sometimes think of it more shamanic. If I was going to put an orientation, it was more shamanic than Jungian, but that's pretty close in a lot of ways.
Thanks.
Shall I continue? And I think it's now, I'm going to move to just a real short talk on how I see Dick and Fritz being similar and dissimilar, and how that influenced Gestalt that Dick did. And one way to look at it is what intersubjectivity theory calls conjunctions and disjunctions. Places where Dick's and Fritz's experiences were similar, and Fritz's Gestalt therapy had kind of things that were friendly to Dick's psychological world, and places where they were dissimilar. I think it was very subjective appealing to Dick was Pearl's idea of personal autonomy and self-sufficiency. I think best expressed as organismic self-regulation. In today's thinking, it sounds a bit like an oxymoron, organismic self-regulation. But I think it was tremendously subjective appealing to Dick. The idea that there's no external authority and that the ideas of an autonomous criterion for adjustment or value. And Dick's overriding concern to not be judged from the outside. It's something he said a lot. His own painful history is involved here. Atwood came here once, George Atwood, and Bob Stoller, actually, they came here twice teaching workshops. And I found out, I was having a talk with George at a party here, and I found out that he had been researching a paper along the lines of Faces in a Cloud. Does everybody know that word? Atwood and Stoller's first book basically says that what psychology needs is a theory of subjectivity itself, because the best explanation for the different theories is the subjective life history of the theorists. And so they did a book that was an exploration of Freud, Rank, Reich, and Jung along those lines. So this was a paper they'd researched on Fritz. And so I said, you know, I'm going to be writing in this area. George, is there any way to get access to what you guys concluded? I would be very interested in it. And he completely turned the tables on me, and he said, well, what do you think about it in one sentence? And I said, I think it's about Fritz having to live a life of vulnerability denied. And George said that is exactly what our conclusions were. And I think that's how you need to look at this idea of self-sufficiency as an answer, and the idea of organismic self-regulation. And I think, you know, Fritz's position on self-regulation, to quote Fritz, sounds exactly like I could hear this is something that Dick could have said. I don't know that he ever did, but it's certainly something he could have said. It means that the organism is left alone to take care of itself without being meddled with from the outside. And so I think this idea of what one can almost call the reification of autonomy, which is certainly subjectively appealing to me, being at the time a strict individualist, I think it affirmed the validity of Dick's experience that the authority is inside and that it's accessible to awareness, that it's accessible to me just as me. So that's a way I think their worlds were similar. A second way I think their worlds were similar was Perles's emphasis on the physical body. Because I think it validated one of the primary ways that Dick dealt with his own problematic experience, which was grounding the experience in the here and now, in the felt physical reality of the body. The third thing I think that their worlds were very similar on was this idea of emphasis on emotional expression. I think that was a central ethic in Perles's Gestalt therapy, and this idea of working with past experience by bringing it into the now, and kind of recreating the experience psychodramatically. And Dick came up with his version of that, which he called enter, allow, accept, and express. That was the formulation in his Gestalt work for that idea. And I think it's because this idea of a toxic introject, and the implication that you could get it outside and expel it. Does this make sense to people? But probably the most important place that their worlds came together was this idea of awareness as means and end. That, I think, the signal of contribution of really Fritz's, this is what I think, is that was the utilization of awareness as a curative factor. The intervention of awareness, as Fritz said, per se, by, and of itself. But I think what was most important for Dick was that it signaled he could trust Fritz. Because it was so closely aligned with his Buddhist background. And I'll quote Dick to prove the point. This is Dick talking. My background was one of Buddhist studies. So what I also saw almost immediately was the parallel between Fritz's awareness training and the heart of Buddhist meditation, a text that claims to be based on the discourse of the Buddha 25 centuries ago. Here was a book apart from the lack of interpersonal possibilities, but in terms of awareness exercises that could be used as a textbook in Gestalt. So naturally I went on to train with Fritz. And then there was the places where they really weren't very alike. And I think that the primary place was Fritz's commanding, authoritative showman personality. That is just not who Dick was. And so it would be obvious to ask the question, how did Dick deal with Fritz's command and control personality? There's a great vignette, a little story about that. Dick and Fritz are sitting in the lodge, and Fritz was a fairly demanding person, and so he was telling Dick what he wanted done at Esalen, and Dick looked up at him and said, "Fritz, I'm not here to live up to your expectations." And Fritz said, "Oh yes, you are." But it also shows a way that Dick dealt with things, and he had amazing humor. And that's just a real classic thing. And there's something that Fritz couldn't have forgotten for a moment. Dick was the landlord. So I think Dick's answer to the command and control kind of authoritative part of Fritz was this idea, maximum availability, minimum coercion, and the permission to fully experience without the fear or the inhibition of being judged, coerced, evaluated, controlled. I mean, Dick was wide open to people's experience. And I think if somebody was having an experience that was completely outside any frame of reference, that was great for Dick. He really liked that. Something he had never seen before that didn't fit any system he knew. He was completely okay with that and embraced it and would validate that experience in the person. It was really amazing that way. And I think more than any of his contemporaries, his support for the validity of the subjective experience of the people he worked with, I think he was the champion of that, of anyone I've ever seen. And I think that was his answer to Fritz's sort of command and control. Another big difference was physicality. Dick's immense sense of physicality versus Fritz's frailness. And so here the breath and body emphasis, the body is refuge. And Dick had an absolute fearlessness in working with people, fearless about anything that might come up, about using himself in the work, about having people test their strength with him, although that was always done in a completely respectful way. It was a way they were quite different. And the third difference, I think, is Pearl's general negative attitude towards spirituality. I'm sure you've all heard the famous quotes like meditation is neither shitting nor getting off the pot, or something Fritz said. But with Dick, it was a complete identification with spirituality. I think that difference was somewhat obviated as this idea of awareness as means end. But I think what's most important is that Dick's spirituality was foundational for his absolute respect of the validity of the experience of the people he worked with. I think, and this is my opinion from watching him, that Dick accessed a kind of spiritual dimension that did two things. On one part, sort of saw the interconnectedness of everything, and on the other side of that coin would be respect for the other person in their complete difference, that he had such a wide tolerance. You could be any way. He would accept you just how you were. It was very powerful. So on the one hand, everything is interconnected, but on the other hand, difference is completely okay, because everything's interconnected. Does this make sense? Yeah. So now I'd like to talk about how I see the 4 innovations of Gestalt practice. The first innovation is that this is an awareness practice for the facilitator as well. And that's something that he really demonstrated in his work, which is remarkable. As I said, the first time I saw him working, I was completely attracted because I got it. This guy's doing a spiritual practice while he's working with people. And it's something that I really took from him, and it's very important in my work. I think if you're not getting that, it gets old pretty quick. But that it can be an awareness practice that's spiritual was really quite profound. And as we've talked about several times, a greater emphasis on the physical body and breath as tools. I think that was an innovation. I think that the emphasis on quality awareness over content was another kind of really big innovation to me. And Dick always said that he was following the Buddhist precept of the wisdom of equality. And what he would say about it in practical terms is it makes no difference what the figure being worked on is, but the quality of awareness you bring to that figure makes a difference. And in his way of working, in that way you could always take one step back. If somebody's resisting figure, then you look at resistance as the figure. And you always have a place to go.
Excuse me a moment. Could
Yeah.
we take a bit of a break?
Yeah.
I gotta go to the bathroom.
Okay. Go ahead.
I don't like to interrupt, walk across the room.
Go ahead and do it. Do it anyway.
Right. And asking for a break was a way of providing some drink.
So I would be open for questions while we're taking a break.
We don't need a break.
Keep going.
Excuse me.
And I think his absolute respect for the validity of a person's experience was another innovation in Gestalt. And I think when Dick did that, he was giving what he most wanted and needed. Because he was somebody who didn't have the validity of his subjective reality affirmed in his family of origin. And I think it's a really important thing. I'm going to quote Atwood and Stolrow here, because I think they really label something that's important. And this is them talking, not me. The claim that no personal reality is more true or valid than another, we understand as a solution to a relentless early experience of invalidation and psychological usurpation. The image of coexisting, differently organized subjective worlds, each to be understood on its own terms, symbolically concretizes the hope for a mode of relatedness in which authentic inner experience is protected. The claim that no personal reality is more true or valid than another, we understand as a solution to a relentless early experience of invalidation and psychological usurpation. The image of coexisting, differently organized subjective worlds, each to be understood in its own terms, symbolically concretizes the hope for a mode of relatedness in which authentic inner experience is protected. And I think Dick's work engendered profound feelings of acceptance in the people he worked with. That was something, when I was interviewing people for my dissertation, I heard over and over again. And again, I attribute that to the spiritual dimension of him. Because he didn't have to have comments. Nobody had to have a comment. He didn't have to fit anybody to his way of thinking. Anything could be real or true. Anything that could be worked on that could be experienced. Everything was valid. And that's precisely the stance that you need to take with more severely disturbed people. And that's something that Gestalt's always had a little difficulty with. This idea of the protecting and affirming and validating the subjective reality of the person. And the last innovation is the thing that I have really come to talk to you about. Dick developed a very elegant and simple paradigm for what now we would call the organization of experience in the people he worked with. And he called his paradigm message, program, filter. He didn't write about it. In fact, well, the first time I heard him talk about it, I went, Dick, where can I read about this? And he said, oh, you can read about it anywhere. It was a typical response for him, but I guess what he didn't say is you sure can't read it in any of the Gestalt writings that I know about. But he didn't say that. And it's true, you can read about it everywhere, but it's a very pithy understanding put in very simple language. And it came out of his just reflecting over years and years of working with people. And that we could call it ongoing structures of ground, that's one way to say it, but it's really about how experience is meaningfully organized. So let me run through this. Messages. These are the powerful early messages, most often by primary caretakers, about life, the world, how one is, or how one needs to think, act, feel, or do. And the messages can be conveyed either consciously or unconsciously. In fact, they're even more powerful usually when they're unconscious, i.e. what parents do as opposed to what they say. The program is how you put the early messages into action. It's how the messages are both construed and an action plan developed in relation to them. And to Dick, that was always directly related to what he called the 3 S's: safety, security, and survival. The filter then becomes how the program is actualized over time, and really about how it's generalized. It's usually, comes up, these programs, under the best thing the child can do in the circumstances that he's in: safety, security, and survival. But when it becomes now a filter through which you see the world, you start acting as though the original limitations of your family were still intact. They were still present. Dick used to call that acting now as if it were back then. And all 3, message, program, filter, come to form patterns. And they're strong recurrent patterns of perception and action, again, directly related to the 3 S's. And the thrust of therapy, although he hated that word, because he thought therapy was something that's done to you. But the thrust of the work then in Gestalt becomes to be aware and over time develop the creative alternative, so that the creative alternative can be equally viable. And how you do that is to really begin to appreciate the power of the program. What he meant by that was how it served you and how it's not serving you now. And he always used the same example every time I heard him talk about this. And it's curious, I think, I don't know if he ever thought about this, but the roles are absolutely reversed. He talked about a young girl and her father, but this is really a little bit about him and his mother. The example he would use is a little girl growing up begins to have kind of a ritualized experience with her father, and that if she performs for him, that she gets love, attention, that kind of thing. So over time now, this can generalize to where I, as the little girl, can think the only way I'm going to get love and attention is to perform. And so now every situation she comes into, performance is the answer. But what's not the answer, what's left completely out of the picture, is being. It's a being versus doing split. That I'm valued only when I do, not being or just who I am. And the creative alternative, as he would describe it, is to support the idea of you're okay for just who you are without the need to do anything. And he said that the problem is, he used to describe it like this: if this is the creative alternative and this is the program that's in place, that it takes a while for those things to kind of come together. That it takes a lot of work for those things to become equal opportunities for the person. And remember, no judgment, no coercion, no analysis, but I break my own rule when I lay out my paradigm message program filter. This is a way of looking at how experience is organized. It's put in very simple language, but it's a very complex idea, I think. Any questions about that? Did I explain it in a way that was clear enough? I think what's most important is you think about Fritz's work and the style that he did. And I know a lot of you in here are contemporary Gestaltists, and the style Gestalt is sort of going through. I think it's really useful to look at this as a bridge between Fritz's style of Gestalt and more contemporary styles of Gestalt. Let's see if I can throw away my notes and do this. You know, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not completely up to date probably on the Gestalt literature, there have been three general ideas about how to fix, improve, change Fritz's style into something that's more contemporary. And the people who supported those ideas were all in this room. I think one of them went to the bathroom. We'll see if he returns. But Gordon Wheeler, Lynn Jacobs, and Stephen Tobin, excuse me. And the first idea is what Gordon has always advocated, and advocated in his first book, Gestalt Reconsidered, and that's the idea of putting direct focus on ongoing structures of grounding, not the figure in isolation. Does this make sense to people? You've heard this? The second way to kind of improve Gestalt, I guess you could say, is to with Gordon's, the idea is to revisit some of the contributions of Lynn and Goldstein. With Lynn Jacobs and Stefan, this idea of returning to Buber, and supporting an I-thou relationship. And what does Buber say, if I can remember it correctly, to treat the other as the very one you are? To try to imagine what their world is. Kohut's empathy comes to mind here. And the final way is to incorporate ideas from self-psychology and intersubjectivity theory. You guys may know more, but those are the three that I'm really aware of. And I think Message Program Filter provides at least a partial answer and is midway kind of along a path to where Gestalt is today. When I started working with people using Message Program Filter, the thing that I discovered for myself was, look, the Pearlsian model's got two big problems. It doesn't have a developmental theory. That's a big problem. And it tends to devalue the fundamental importance of relationships in both the cause and the cure. And I think that's what that's what Lynn, I assume, you can dispute me if I'm wrong, and Gordon, and Stefan are trying to get to in their ways to improve Gestalt. So I'm going to return to my notes. I think message program filter from what he got from Fritz is really revolutionary. The other sort of innovations that he had really fit with who Dick was as a person. But message program filter is something new, and it's something he thought up largely on his own. And to me, it expands the parameters of the Pearlsian model. I think there's 6 things that are really important about message program filter. The first is it makes the practitioner consider the structures of the ground and not just the emergent figure in isolation. When you have to account for how the ground is structured, relational and developmental factors naturally emerge as prominent features. The second point is that message program filter facilitates viewing the experience of the client from a perspective within, or rather than outside his own subjective world. Because you've got to imagine the filter through which that world is seen and how the filter was created. And this idea of an I-thou attitude coming from Buber was really the quintessential attitude of Dick's work. Absolute respect for the subjective reality of the people he worked with. Again, Coates' empathy comes to mind. The third point is message program filter provides a perspective for looking at psychotherapy over a much longer time frame than the Pearlsian model suggests or would allow. I mean, I think Fritz even said that towards the end of his career that work with individuals was obsolete, that everything should happen in the context of a group. Fourth, message program filter moves the focus of therapy from emotional expression towards an exploration of the meaning of past and present emotional experience. And fifth, message program filter provides a frame for identifying principles around which experience is unconsciously organized, a way of mapping the subjective world, something that contemporary Gestalt therapists have also called for in Gestalt therapy.
You said that last one.
This idea of mapping the subjective world. One solution to it is self-object theory from Coates' work. Another possibility is Gordon has called ongoing structures of ground. How does that work? How do we begin to look at how experience is meaningfully organized? What are the repetitive patterns? How do they come into form? How can they be worked with? And sixth, and probably most importantly, by encouraging the investigation of early relational interaction patterns, the message program filter paradigm also encourages an intersubjective, i.e. interacting worlds of experience in terms of mutual influence. And it's a view of development, and I think it really suggests that possibility for Gestalt therapy. So that's the part of his work that I found to be the most important personally, and I'm really happy to have presented it to you today. I hope that makes some sense to you.
If you're taking comments and questions, I wonder if you could start with Bob and Deb.
Okay,
And then ask the, think about comment.
go ahead.
Oh, really great. In the context of storying, Gestalt as a storying practice as part of what we explored this week. And I'm realizing how much Dick Price's influence, which I knew almost nothing about until just now, is an oral tradition by and so I mean, you've written some of this down, but so I'm struck by that.
I want to go in. I want to find out. Okay, first I want to say, as an oral, as being engaged in the storying process, I'm so grateful that you have brought Dick Price to my attention and to our attention, because of the fact that he's part of an oral tradition. I'm wondering how many people there are in this room, if I could ask that, who have worked with Dick Price. I'm quite curious. So that was it's one of the, a lot actually, but
Why?
wide life. The contrast between the radiant image that smiles from the walls of Little House and the monk in the shadows that you describe strikes me right away. So I see such charisma in his face. I've been enjoying watching his grandson here on the floor. So I'm just struck by the power of this man that you described and the quality of the Buddhist teachings which he's brought into our practice, which I've never felt I've had a handle on. I'm supposed to be asking a question. I haven't found the question yet. I'm just feeling very grateful for the work you've done and what you've spoken about. I am curious. Now, I think I'll let the curiosity. The tragedy of the zeitgeist of the time that he lived in, and that there wasn't the support for the questing that he was doing, which of course so many of us have flourished as a result of there being cultural support for it, is another thing that strikes me very powerfully. So, those are my remarks. I hope you have some questions.
I also want to say thank you so much. That this gives me a sense of, I did not know anything about Dick Clark before I heard Dick Clark. Boy, sorry about that one. Dick Christ. It dates me, yes. Can we dance now? Before I heard you, I want to start with Deb's last point. I was all the way through it. I was so impressed with what appeared to me as his sense of hope all the time in everything that he did. And you mentioned that at one point about his hope of, how did you put it?
That Esalen could turn into a
For,
life.
yeah, hope for a mode of relatedness in which authentic experience is protected. And how relational that is, and how so far ahead of his time he was in terms of the elements of relationship that we think about now, about being able to relate from a sense of authentic self and being able to respect that place, and how that is such a spiritual quality as again, I've been re-experiencing in this conference that we have here. I don't have a question for you.
Well, I'll answer it anyway. You know, Dick didn't think relationally the way that we might now, but a lot of time has passed and a lot of new theories have been coming forward that he acted relationally. I mean, you could, it's crazy when I try to think about this now because, you know, if you worked with Dick, he stayed in this simple rule structure, and if you said to him something like, well, Dick, I really want to know what you think about this, he would often say, well, put Dick on a pillow and ask him. So there were ways in which we would now think of him as not being very relational. He said that because the Gestalt work he did was primarily intrapersonal and not interpersonal. But if you talk to people he worked with, and we've got a few in the room, I can't imagine they won't agree with me. Ultimately, what was the most valuable thing for me in my work with him was the relationship I had with him.
I can feel that.
Yeah, because it was a relationship, it was the first one I ever had, where somebody absolutely and completely accepted me for just who I was without me having to be different in any way. And that was the power that was transformative. So he may not have talked in relational language, but his relationship was the curative factor. I mean, Lynn wrote a book called The Human Relationship in Gestalt Therapy. And I don't know that he would have even appreciated me talking about it that way, but it was certainly my experience and the experience of many other people.
It also what Deb said, that it speaks to the difficulty of being able to sustain a relational connection in that time and period, that there just was no support for that, and that in spite of that, he did create an emotional connection.
I have a couple of questions. One, technique-wise, did he normally use the open seat or the hot seat or whatever it's called today?
He called it the open seat because he wanted to get away from Fritz's idea of a hot seat. So he would set up camp in one of the rooms here 3 or 4 times a week, and anybody here could come in and work with him. And it was an open seat and an open sort of arena. He had lots of little kind of pithy instructions that he would use. I'm trying to think of some of them now, but none are coming to mind if I hang on it a little longer. Technique-wise, he stayed very consistent within a mode. I mean, from Fritz, this idea of, well, he basically, I know I'm not looking for the one. He said, I only say 3 things when I work with people. What is your experience now? What are you doing now? And how should I know?
Is that work that's still going on with work scholarship, open seat? You see it's posted that there's an open seat for 2 hours. Is that
Yes.
the same tradition?
It's the same tradition.
The other question was, you referred to the filter. How is that similar or different than the filter referred to in cognitive therapy or other, approaches?
Well, you could call it scripts. There's lots of things you could call it. It was just his way, of saying that. I think, I actually talked to George Atwood about it and said, what do you think about this? Are these things analogous to what you guys call organizing principles? Organizing principles in intersubjectivity theory are the emotional conclusions and convictions that we come to that are forged in the crucible of our relational surrounds. And he said, there are basically analogous, but we would argue with filter. Because filter presupposes a world out there that if I remove the filter, that I can see, and that's real and true. And so you could say that it's a Cartesian way of looking at things. Now we have much more sophisticated language to talk about this stuff. He was developing this in the mid-70s and beyond, and there wasn't the kind of zeitgeist that there is now, a postmodern sort of way of looking at things. Does that make sense?
That leads me to, I'm not sure that you addressed what you said you might at the beginning, which was, what would he be thinking now, were he still alive? That really caught my interest.
Well, I've got 2 more sections to go. Because I was also going to talk a little bit about my journey and stuff as well. Chris?
Yeah, just a little comment referring back a bit to this question of individuality and human relationship with Dick. Because the thing about put me on the pillow and talk to me, as a function of the role, he referred to it as reflector, which we still do. And he used the mirroring as a primary function. But it was all based in the practice of presence. And his basic presence was one of humanity. And so the relationship was of his presence, which was had nothing to do with role, which I think was what was so wonderful about sitting with him. He was not into much role, and he wasn't that interested in role. But he did believe that the empowerment of a person was through mirroring them. And I often think of it as Aikido. He was an Aikido master when he did open seat. As people tried to give him their power, instead of that active kind of frustration that I would see in early tapes of Gestalt, what he would kind of call the hard Gestalt version, it was more like an Aikido, just taking somebody's energy that they were going to give him one way or another, and just rolling it back to them with humor and without much contest. And so that was the part of the relationship I saw, was a constant presenting back to the person both a reflection of their own empowerment, their own juice, their own discovery, their own intelligence, whatever it was they were in contact with, to empower the contact through this mirroring, but always with a full sense of him there, present. So it wasn't about giving back his personality, but about giving back his humanity. And so I found it a pretty wonderful combination. Probably most of the people in this room are doing that as well, in the way we sit with people, but he was very precise with it. And it was very trustworthy, would be my way of saying.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And another thing I think you have to consider in this, and to coattail on what Chris has to say, is Dick was working with people who he had multiple relationships with. And I think one of the ways that people felt protected, because he was the boss here, this was his place, Michael was in San Francisco, was that you could absolutely depend upon him to be in a very consistent role, that he wouldn't step outside of it. And if he did, he would always let you know. He would say, I'm speaking to you as Dick Price right now. I'm not in my role as reflector anymore. And, you know, this causes a big, there's a whole big dimension we can go into as a result of this. But I think that was a very important part of it. How do you work with people that you have not only dual relationships with, but quadruple and quintuple, and it goes way up here. And that was a way that I think that it developed safety in people. You could look at it a different way and start talking about it in terms of transference. That's a whole other ballgame, and that's a whole other road to go down. Because dependency was a big issue for Dick. And he didn't like people to depend on him, and he didn't want to depend on other people. And I think that comes out of his family background. A couple of his male friends that were hiking partners, I think he selected us out because we didn't put many demands on this person. We were people who were okay, we could get along, ourselves. So there's that part of it too. And to me, this is something I was going to talk about. There's two big things that humanistic psychology never really dealt with well, nor Gestalt. Transference and how experience is organized across the lifespan. They're just not good models. And if I could name anyone that I wish Dick could be alive to meet, it's George Atwood. Because of their shared interest in psychotic experience, and George Atwood works with people actively, for the whole idea of considering them to be treatable as somebody in psychoanalysis, and because the idea of transference and intersubjectivity theory, I think Dick would have immediately grasped that transference isn't projection, it's not distortion, it's not regression. Transference is just organizing activity. I can't not do that if I'm the facilitator. The client cannot not do that. It's just organizing activity. A vignette, but then, this is Dick in 75 and 80. I'm talking about it from 25 years later. But I think one way you could look at it is, do you know the expression bear trapper from Fritz's book? Yeah. Well, it's used to describe people today who we might call, although I hate this label, borderline. But what does that mean? That just means somebody with a very labile transference. Their organizing activity is very labile, switch around all the time. I remember Dick telling one of my close personal friends about a woman that he worked with up in Monterey at the time, and he was mad because he'd been bear trapped by her. He wasn't mad at her. He was mad at himself for falling into the trap. Does this make sense? Somebody who was very needy and needed him to be a certain way. One other way you could say it probably is in contemporary forms of somebody whose organization was very archaic and you had to be just so to be with her. Not much tolerance for not being just so. I think everyone's had experience with working with people who are like that. But if you look at it in a deeper way, she's just putting into play how she organizes everybody in her life. And there's only one way out of the trap, and that's to fall into it.
And it's what?
To fall into it. There's no way out of the trap other than to fall into it. Does this make sense to people? And you know, it's a real difficult thing, but I think Dick instantly would have grasped that. Hey, this person's just organizing me how she organizes everybody. Transference is just organizing activity. It's nothing more than that. It's not any of those other things, and we all do it all the time. And that's the attitude of intersubjectivity theory towards transference. So I think it's a real good one. And I think it fits in with Dick's other paradigm. And I think Dick really could have learned from George. They're so similar. I think George Atwood is an intellectual version of Dick. And for those of you who know Dick, that may sound like an oxymoron. But because he's a very intellectual guy. He's not this physical person Dick was. But they're so similar in feeling to him. And I think they instantly would have gotten along together. And, you know, I don't know if Dick's, Dick, at this point, if he was still alive, you're all here. I know intersubjectivity theory and self-psychology are part and parcel of what you guys have been talking about. Would he have gone that direction? It's interesting to also think, you know, when he was developing this stuff, who around here really could have helped him? The only person that comes to mind that I know that was here was Bion, because he was working in LA at the time, whose understanding and who's of psychotic kind of experience and willing to work with that and really willing to be there with somebody and yet at the same time have a lot of knowledge. But the chances of those two guys finding each other are like a needle in the haystack, because this wasn't the place that particularly valued psychoanalysis in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So where would Dick have gone with this? I don't know. And I think it's kind of ridiculous to speculate in a way, but he certainly solved the problem of the organization of experience. What would happen as conceptions of transference and how that all worked? He certainly knew about Kohut's work. There was some things floating around about inviting Kohut here by both Dick and Mike at the time, but Kohut died right around that time. So Dick brought people here because he was vitally interested in what they had to say and what he could get from them. And so, you know, the range of people who he could bring here was quite wide.
Did Eric Byrne ever come here?
Did who?
Eric Byrne?
It's possible, I don't know that.
Yes, he did come here.
Okay.
I think you said earlier that Fritz was coming back here after he went away to Lake Cowichan. I thought he was kind of done here, but you implied that had he not died, he was on the way back to lead a group with Dick, do you say?
Yeah, when Dick went up to Lake Cowichan to work with Fritz in '69, according to what he told Walter Anderson, this is Dick, that they were going to come back and co-lead a group together. But Fritz died, and Dick ended up leading the group by himself. So that's my knowledge, and it's in the literature and out there. And I think I've even heard the tape where he talks to Anderson about that.
What happened in Dick's relationships with his parents later?
That's a hard subject. Did Dick never forgive his parents? Maybe, maybe not. Did his attitude toward them soften? Absolutely. He made it clear to his sister that he didn't really want to deal with them in their last days. He didn't go to his father's funeral. And he He didn't go back to see his mother. It's a little bit tricky for me to say because Chris is in the room, but I think the thing that was clearly transformative as far as everyone who knew Dick here, the most transformative thing in his life was his relationship with Chris and the birth of his daughter Jenny and being a father. And I think that took a lot of the sting out of his past. Did his family come to recognize that that was true? I don't think so. But I think it was true for Dick. And I certainly knew him in his last days. And, you know, I think that he had made the long journey to realizing that life could truly be satisfying. And I think Chris and Jenny had everything to do with that. Sorry if that's embarrassing, Chris.
And I'm remembering Jenny's birthday is right in the same time. It's kind of a packed piece of the year. And I was writing about her birth the other day. And I was remembering Vic and her birth. And we had her at the little house. She was born there. So, you know, putting her in his arms and him just starting to weep and crying for 3 hours with a complete smile on his face the whole time. And just saying over and over, I just keep getting touched. And so that's a little snapshot of something that started at that moment and went on, I'm sure, till he died. It was just like that. There was a meltdown.
Go ahead, Gordon.
I also wanted to say, just so everybody knows, not to put you guys on the spot over there, but because of the experience of active fathering that came to him later in life, Dick's son, David Price, is also in the room, and Kasha, and I see Alexander is asleep now, I think. And I just wanted to mention that so everybody can be aware of the lineage and that heritage.
But it was a long road for Dick with his past. It was a hard road. And I think it's ultimately, there's sad parts to this tale, but it's ultimately really redemptive. Because this guy became a validating other for people in ways that he never had somebody to be for him. And I think that's the kind of redemptive part of all of this. Is that he literally gave to people what he most needed. And in some way, that's the way we all get it. To give away the thing that we most need. And I promised to talk a little bit about my journey in Gestalt. And this is the part that will tie in with my recovering individualist. I came to Big Sur in 1975 to be a forest ranger to get away from everybody and everything. In my first vacation, this idea of self-sufficiency was completely appealing to me. I was a meditator. I was, the whole kind of Gestalt thing was really subjectively appealing to me. Like Dick, I had issues with dependency that I didn't want to deal with. Like Fritz, I certainly had issues with vulnerability that I didn't want to deal with. And this was the perfect place to come. Big Sur, I came here, I ran the horse patrol program for a while as a ranger, and that was my life. And my first month's vacation, I came here and did a month-long workshop, sort of in late 75, early 76, in which Dick did an Gestalt work, and we met. And the ranger station house that I came here to live in happens to be the very house to the south of Esalen. And they came up to me at the end of the month and said, we know you live next door. We're going to put you on the special guest list. You're free to come and go here as you will. And I first learned body work here, and as I realized that my problems were probably more psychological than physical, I started working with Dick and became a student of Dick. And I've made a long journey. After Dick's death, I really tried to solve the developmental part of this by studying a couple of people's work who I highly recommend, one in particular. And one of them is Alan Fogel, and the other is Klaus Reigel, who died. But they both are developmentalists who really write about mutual influence and co-regulation that whole idea, but neither one of them have a clinical theory. Alan Fogel wrote a book called Developing Through Relationships that I think every Gestalt therapist should read. And I think Gordon agrees with me. We found Fogel independently, but he's quite a guy. He's part of the dynamic systems theory group, except he's eminently readable, unlike Hale. And Klaus Reigel was responsible for developing something called dialectical psychology. And again, it posits an active person in an active environment and mutual influence. And so now we're getting away from my individualist bent. So to develop a clinical part of that theory, one of Dick's other students, who's a very close post-personal friend of mine, started studying Stoller and was one of his groups in LA for about 10 years. And so about 10 years ago, I started studying intersubjectivity. And there's a punchline to this. I think I'm now finally in the position of proving Dick's Esalen rule. But before I say that, I want to go into one other place. I think that my theoretical position is now on the leading edge of my own psychological development rather than the trailing edge when I was embracing Gestalt therapy. And I have now proven Dick's rule for Esalen. Teachers teach what they most need to learn themselves, and they are their own worst students. And I'd like to end with a poem that for me is particularly fitting. It's from Yeats, and it's only four lines long. And the title of the poem is Gratitude to the Unknown Instructors. What they undertook to do, they brought to pass. All things hang like a drop of dew upon a blade of grass. Thank you. You know, I think Dick would have supported me in writing a little bit about his approach. I don't think he'd have been here to listen tonight.